Hi, I'm Austin and welcome back to the Marshall Modification Project. In this series, we are exploring Marshall amp modification from an academic perspective.
I'm Steve Waxman, and today we're interviewing Lee Jackson of Metaltronix Amps. While you're watching, keep in mind this is an academic interview, and our approach is to stay out of the way as much as possible and give Lee room to talk about his career and his perspectives in his own words. We hope you enjoy the interview. Let's get rolling.
You know, obviously the original thing with amplifiers was just to be heard, right?
Absolutely.
Because the drums were so loud that, you know, any acoustic instrument was being drowned out. So the first pickups, all that stuff was just to be heard, right? That was the big, you know, it wasn't really till Les Paul who kind of fine-tuned it more and more and more. And then, you know, and it was always based on clean, right? And that was the same thing with bass. Everybody tried to get as clean as possible. And that's what started the 5-watt wars in the 50s. And that's when they changed over from cathode to grid bias so they could get more horsepower out of these amplifiers at a cleaner volume, right? And because cathode distorts a lot faster, and it's a whole different sound compared to the grid biasing. And so then you know, as you move forward on that, it wasn't until, you know, you move into the 60s where people just wanted to be louder and louder. And all of a sudden, when they turned them all the way up, they just started realizing, wow, that's a cool sound, distortion, right? And I mean, you know, fuzz tones actually came first, because if you see some of the 50s stuff where the guys used to take pencils and stab the speakers to get that fuzz sound, you know, they were just emulating that, right, at lower volumes when they first started doing fuzzes, because, you know, stabbing speakers only lasts so long, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, as that progression moved, and then we started getting artists like, you know, Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix and these guys starting to realize if they turn their amps all the way up, they get a sound, right? And then Jimmy took it to a whole nother level when he started plugging distortion pedals in and that kind of stuff that drove it even more and more and more. And, you know, more stacks, more volume, more everything, right? And so that's the very first beginning of that kind of distortion, right? And you know, because of my age, that is my era, right? I was playing as a kid during those years, and you know, my very first big amp was a Marshall stack, you know. And you know, the thing with me though was wild is that I had an SG and I had a twin, and we had these little LBP1 boosters, and that's what we tried to do to make them have some form of distortion. And then I saw the Jimi Hendrix movie, and it was like life-changing, you know, the one where he plays in that white room with his acoustic, and you know, and I watched that, and it was like I walked out of that theater going, I have to have a Stratocaster. I have to have a Stratocaster. So I bought a Stratocaster, saved up my pennies. I show up at rehearsal, had a band at the time. I had my Marshall stack. Here's my Stratocaster. I plug into a stock Marshall, and it's like loud twang. I mean, it's like, wait a second. That's not what I was hearing in the movies, right? It was like really, you know, I mean, it has an edge of distortion, but it didn't sound like you were hearing, you know, what Jimmy was getting because he used 2 devices to boost his sound, his Univibe and his fuzz face. Both those had gain, right? And so he was driving the front end of these things, which when I got home, I was really depressed. Now my SG sounded great through the Marshall, because you had so much more output and so much more gain. So this is how my journey started, because at the time, you know, the NAMM shows were always closed to the public, but if you were a good customer at a music store, and I was buying a Marshall stack, they loved me. I was invited to the NAMM show, and if you got invited, you could go, right? The general public was not allowed. And in those years, way back then, all the original, like the engineers, the owners, everybody was at the NAMM show then, because it wasn't such a thing where people were hiding, right? I mean, you could go right up and talk to any of them, right? So this one year, I walk in, and I obviously go right to the Marshall booth. And in that year, one of their top engineers was in the booth.
Mm.
And I start talking to him, and I'm a kid, but I obviously asked the right questions because he stopped, sat with me, because I was saying, man, I got this problem. I listened to Jimi Hendrix, and he happened to be one of the guys that worked on Jimmy's stuff.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, I'm trying to get this sound and da 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 da. Anyway, he goes, look, when I get back to England, give me your address. I will scribble on a schematic, and I will send you some stuff that you can try. And I thought, yeah, sure, right. I'm never gonna get this. But lo and behold, I get a schematic, and somewhere I've got it framed. It's put away somewhere, but I have that schematic where he wrote his notes on what to change and what to get me closer to that sound. Well, that's my journey. I started modifying. I started seeing how things changed and how I could, make this sound more and more of what I was hearing in my head. At the same time, I was working for different companies, BC Rich Guitars doing their electronics. I worked for Oberheim. I worked for Paul Revere in his original days in the garage. Me and Paul worked together, which was my first really learning on distortion stages, right? On figuring out how, you add stages, you do this, you do that, this changes this changes that. So me and Paul, at that time, we're doing all the session guys that were happening in Hollywood. And we later went on to working at Fender. I went into actually, he went first because I went over to Oberheim for a little while. And I get a call, and he's like, hey, you want a job in R&D at Fender? I said, yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I went over to work with Fender, and he was in, what was interesting is they used him a lot in marketing. He wanted somebody that knew what he did in R&D, and I was in there and worked with all of them there, which was a growing experience. But the point is as I started learning what I needed to know more and more on, I was working on this stuff for myself, right? I was fine-tuning the sound. At the same time, I'm in bands in Hollywood playing on the Sunset Strip, right? So I'm playing in these popular bands, and I'm starting to get a great sound, which is starting to cause attention. I would see some big names. Well, they later became big names. They were little names in the early years, but in the crowd, right? They were all around me. And so while this was going on, at one point I decided, you know what? I'm going to go out on my own and try this thing myself. I was at Fender. I came up with the name Metatronics. I said, my wife wasn't too happy about it, but I came home, hey, we're going to try something new. We're going to move from Orange County back up to LA, and I'm going to start this company out of my bedroom, basically. So I had gone through some of these like Anthony Robbins programs where they're like, you got to present yourself. So what I did is I put a full page ad out in Guitar Player magazine saying, I'll create your dreams. And, here's a phone number, and basically sat by the phone. And, I had to win every time the call came in. I had to make decisions on cost and what I could do for them. And sometimes I was winning, sometimes I was losing. And what I mean by that is sometimes I'd work on something for a month and lose all the money I was making on it. And other things I could do quickly and do well. So that started exploding. And when Hollywood found out that I was doing this, because people wonder, well, how did you get all the, because, I had all the big names at that time coming into me. And it was because we all knew each other, right? We all knew each other from the Sunset Strip. And so I started, the very first amp that I did was for George Lynch for Under Lock and Key. and worked on that, with him at the studio too. We actually had chassis upside down. I was tweaking on him while he was playing on them. And that was kind of like the Eddie Van Halen moment. You know, when Eddie had that sound when he came out and everybody was like the Brown sound, and, you know, it was the same for me. When his album came out, it went crazy. We got calls from all over the world. We started building amps for everybody. I mean, the next album was Rats, Invasion of Privacy, and, you know, Extreme. It just kept going. I mean, every week I was working on a new album. Then we get the call from Steve Vai. He's working on this secret album, which ended up being Eat 'Em and Smile. And he was like, please, can you please help me out? And at the time I was really busy, and I was like, oh, God, you know, we were working on a bunch of projects and I wanted to help him. So what I ended up doing is I sent a couple of my guys out to my house, and they got my personal modified Marshalls, and we took those down and set them up at the studio. And that's the ones he used to record Eat 'Em and Smile with. And then we later built, you know, his tour stuff. But, you know, I mean, I could get into all these, but really what you're looking for is what drove the whole distortion thing. And, you know, it was this blend, right? You're looking for this blend as you're playing, you know, and you could do it multiple ways. You can do it on the front end of the amp. Eddie's doing it actually on the output stage of the amp. You know, why he turned the voltage down was because power amp distortion is the best sounding distortion. Preamp distortion is very buzzy, very sizzly sounding. Power amp distortion has that meat to it, and that's, you know, that's why a lot of artists, like AC/DC and the Scorpions and those guys, they use stock amps, but they use their wirelesses to drive them just a little bit more so that that power amp will distort, right? And live, it's an amazing sound. I don't mean to be jumping around, but while I was doing all this stuff out in Hollywood, you know, I got contacted by AC/DC and I got contacted by the Scorpions. And I actually went to their sound checks, you know, to talk to them. And when I heard their rigs, and I heard, because I learned my lessons on, you know, there's a point where super high gain does not work well in 100,000 watt PAs. They start sounding really mushy. They don't have that edge that people really want. And when I heard Angus's rig, I told him, these were pretty close to it. Both of these meetings were pretty close to the time. I told Angus, I said, look, you know, your sound, modifying is not going to make that better. It's perfect as it is, right? Because you've got the amp lit up, you've got the power amp distortion happening, you've got, you know, all this is why you sound the way you sound. The same thing with the Scorpions. They do the same rig. It's, you know, I think they use, I can't remember that name, the company of the wireless they were all using at that time, which had gain. And, you know, so as the other, to also back up, when I was in playing in top 40 bands, you know, I remember, and I'm sorry for jumping around. I remember we heard about this guy in Whittier that put master volumes on amplifiers. And we're like, well, you know, we had no idea what that was, right? And it ended up being the guy from Trainer, you know, the Trainer amps.
Yeah, sure.
And so I drove out to Whittier with my JMP, you know, it's like, here it is, you know. And I sat there while he puts that one pot in after the, you know, treble pot. And so I get that home, and it's better, but it's not that distortion that we're looking for. So then I read in Guitar Player magazine about these load boxes, right? So I made myself a load box, you know, and put that in between. And that helped, because in the old days, what we have to do is flip the amp around and put a carpet over it, or packing blanket when you played in a club, because you'd devastate everybody because you'd have to turn it up so loud, to sound right. So basically after that is when you start realizing I need more. Yes, pedals at the time, you only had so much a choice in pedals. Basically your fuzzes, right? That was, that you don't, unless you want a fuzz sound, that's different than a distortion sound. And so that was what drove me to start experimenting with moving gain stages around, right? Because you can put it in the front end, and that was what Jose was doing. Because it was me and Jose in Hollywood at the time. We're the old guys, right? We're the original ones that were doing this in Hollywood. And Jose had gain on the input. I put gain in the middle, which I was experimenting with, and after the tone controls. And it was a different sound. We had a complete different sound, which really actually worked out really well, because there's a lot of albums where if there was two guitar players, one would have the Jose mod and the other one would have my mod, right? And that blend you're hearing, like on Rat, that's
Yeah, sure.
that's both amps together on Round and Round and that kind of stuff. So that worked out, and it's a different kind of sound. Like I said, the more you go on the preamp side, the more fuzzy it gets. The more on the output stage, it gets more, that heavier distortion on it. And plus, it allows you to clean up a lot better if you've got less gain on the front end, right? You can turn the volume down and actually get a clean sound, like you hear on Eddie doing, like when he's just turning his volume down and he plays clean, and then he rolls it up and gets his distortion. Because you notice he doesn't use pedals other than flanging and, wah-wahs and that kind of stuff, but not for the distortion sound. But anyway, sorry for being so long-winded, but go ahead, ask anything
Thanks for that, Lee. I mean, the very first question, we've got a series of questions, and the first question
please do.
The first question was, you kind of summarized, you went through it, which was just to give us an idea of your general experience modifying Marshalls throughout the kind of career, which we'll get into. And you've tapped into a few key moments there where you've talked about your work with George Lynch and then your work with others, Steve Vai and so on. That's all really interesting stuff. And I think we've got a good understanding of how your kind of career's developed. The second question is a little bit interesting for, obviously pioneers like yourself. As you say, it was you and Jose that really kicked off all of this stuff, particularly in LA at the time. I don't know if you can think, were you drawn influence from any other modders around, or any historical stuff, or any technical innovations, maybe?
There was no other modders. We were the Paul Rivera was modifying, but he was staying more on the Fender side and the session guys. I was more in the hard rock, because I was playing hard rock downtown. I was more, fine tuning. I was fine tuning it for me. I just decided to start selling it because, as unless you have hit songs, you're eating ketchup sandwiches and you're broke, right? And finally, I was like, hey, I can turn this thing that I created for myself into a business. And when I did, and like I said, when George played it on that album, obviously a lot of people wanted that sound, and we worked on a lot of albums. So yes, there really wasn't anybody that we could not like now, like these guys have all these, not only access to schematics. Remember, we didn't have any internet, so no schematics, no anything. I mean, we just had to experiment, blow up a lot of stuff, So you're just trying, right? You're experimenting, you're trying. That was basically it. There really wasn't anybody to look at their stuff and see what we were doing. It was just trial and error, just trial and error. Fender, when I was working for Fender, they were experimenting with gain stages solely also because of Paul, right? Because Paul brought in the Concert and the Deluxe 2 and Twin 2 and these all had gain stages on the input stages, and made them end channel switching, which was a new thing, which is wild to say, you know. But yeah, no, you know, I mean, obviously, I'm going to learn from being around, you know, all these people doing different things and experimenting and seeing if I like the way that sounds, or seeing the way, if you know what I'm saying. Because I was losing my own ears. It wasn't like somebody came to me and said, "Hey, I'm looking for this kind of sound." I was already creating it, and they were coming in, and I said, "Hey, try this out. Do you want this?" And they would go, "Yes." You know, the only thing that we'd custom do for people would be if there's any added features, or you know, we did a lot of switching pedal board systems and that kind of stuff. You know.
Mm-hmm. Can I just ask you a couple of points?
Sure.
Lee, you mentioned, you know, this thing with the Jimi Hendrix amp, and you got this schematic from one of the Marshall techs. What are you saying, that the Hendrix amp, it wasn't stock? Was it had extra gain stages in it, or was it just something to shape the tone?
No. What he gave me was changes in capacitors, like, you know, beefing up the drive stage with you know, lower value, well, we want to call higher value, lower value, which I've boosting the low end on the output. They there was that, you know, what later, you know, Van Halen, what they call the boost cap, that kind of stuff. Well, these guys were talking about that early on. We're, you know, putting a 0.68 on the tone control driver, and, you know, that kind of stuff, and experimenting with that, experimenting with the input caps also, because, you know, on those JMPs they had 0.002s, and, you know, obviously if you change that to a 0.02, you're going to get more depth out of it, and not so much of that cracked top end. But sometimes you might want that, right? It all depends on your pickups, what kind of music you're playing, you know, all that, you know, makes a difference. But yeah, but no, as for what was on the schematic, there was some resistor value changes, like the in the tone circuit, the 47K, changing, moving that around, so that changed the whole curve of the tone circuit. He just wanted to give me options to try, right? Cool. And you know, he wasn't saying this is, you know, Jimmy's you know, what he did, but as you see over the history, you know, Marshall's went through a bunch of different changes of values, right? In a lot of these places, you know, so he was probably basically talking about what they had been basically trying, you know, compared to the model I had, you know, because the model I had 0.022 phase inverter caps, which are great. A lot of them use that, but you don't have as much low end as a 0.1, that kind of stuff, you know. So change that, and that's something I held on to with a lot of the amps, like when I did my own amps, you know, past the mods, right? But we did it on the mods too. So yeah. Anyway.
So it was kind of primarily tonal changes, I guess, rather than more distortion.
Rather than gain stages. They weren't really, you know, obviously he didn't want me to start, you know, really messing with it too much. He was just giving me some pointers on, you know, what I could do, and try to get more, because I'm probably what I was asking was more depth, you know, because here I am playing a Stratocaster, you know. It was brilliant.
It's going to sound pretty bright.
Yeah, it was very bright. But anyway.
Lee, can you maybe, you know, you can get into as much depth as you want here. We're interested maybe to understand maybe one specific modification that you've made to a Marshall amp, but what we're interested to understand is its effect on the tone compared to the original. So maybe you could kind of talk us through something that might be typical, or something that really springs to mind, you know.
Well, like I said, you know, adding another stage anywhere, right, is gonna drastically change how the amp reacts, how it distorts. Like I said, you can, like, there was you know, later on, one of the mods, which was kind of like what Jose was doing, was where you drive one stage, you know, you plug into the the bass channel, and you tie it into the next channel. So you use both those volume controls as a like a cascading gain. First one drives the second one, and you can blend, which actually adds more gain. It is like adding another tube stage, right, on the input, because it's totally different than when people double, where they plug in a Y chord into both inputs. That doesn't double your gain. That adds depth, because you now have a low end in along with a high end in, and you can kind of get, it adds a little bit, but it's not like driving one stage into the other one. That's a lot more gain. And then what I did was, because I wanted it to be able to clean up more as you turn the guitar down, is I put the gain stage after the tone controls, before the last stage, which is the phase inverter. And what that did is, once you started driving the front end hard, it would then drive that stage hard. And depending on how you biased it, because you could either bias it hot or you could bias it cold, that changed the curve of what kind of sound that you would get out of it. Now, the problem with biasing it hot would be it would be very hissy, because you'd have so much gain and high end, right? But some artists, they don't care. They just wanted that sound, right? If high end and hissy wasn't a situation where other artists were like, hey, that's really hissy. So then what you do is you lower the gain down so that it still gets a great hit, but not quite over the top, like with a higher bias. So yeah, I experimented with that. And then later, when I went to Ampeg and was designing for Ampeg, that's when I came up with the VL series. That's when what I did is I put all the gain stages in front and put the tone controls last, because that's the downside of putting gain after the tone controls before the Ampeg amp, was that your tone controls just become shading. They don't become tone. They're not tone controls like you're used to, where bass and middle, it's more of a shade. And people will go, hey, once I'm way distorted out, my tone controls don't seem to work. Well, they do work, but they don't work like you're thinking. They're more these shades, because tone controls are tone cuts, right? They're not boosts. It's not active. Like your tone controls all the way up to 10 is basically straight through. When you start cutting the tone controls, that's when you cut the bass, you cut the middle, you cut the treble. So what I did when I went to Ampeg was I put the tone, because they were like, everything has to work. We can't have tone controls that are there but not really active. So put them on the very end. And at that point, once you have distortion and all that affected, then your tone controls do a lot. And a lot of companies do that now. Mesa, you name it, they're all putting their tone controls at the end, because it makes it more active sounding. And so yeah, like I said, you can play with the front end, like changing the bias on the front end makes a big difference too. Obviously, like the original Plexis, used a 820 and a 250 microfarad cap, which is a tremendous amount of low end, and then they changed that because it was too thuddy, because the rock guitar players wanted more edge. And so they changed it to a 2.7 and a 0.68, which changes the whole curve of that input stage, and it drops the low end out. And so it's a trade-off, right? So it's part of, that's what you start playing with, because that's what I would sit there as an open amp, a guitar in my hand, and just sit there, just keep tweaking and trying this, and, parts hanging all over the place just to see if I like this or if I don't like that. And, you know what I'm saying? It's so, yeah, I hope that can give you an idea of what you asked for.
Yeah, cool. Just before I hand you to Steve for the next few questions, when you were doing, I'm kind of going off script a little, because
go ahead.
we're meant to for research keep these as open as possible. But I'm interested to know about how you work with George Lynch on that mod. What was going on there?
again, it was what I created for myself. I mean, I was playing on Hollywood, on Sunset Strip at Whiskey and all these places with that mod on my amps, and people were like, you know, it sounded just like, you know, like I said, my sound, he made it famous, right? But I already had that sound live at the time. So when I presented this, you know, people were asking me early on for me to do this for them, and I was like, no, because that's my sound. I'm this guitar player in Hollywood, and you gotta, you know, we sounded awesome live, right? Because I played through double stacks and tons of effects, and you know, everything was modified, and you know, we sounded great when we played, you know, Starwood and all these different clubs. So that's why when I started getting known that I was going to mod amps, they came in and were like, hey, I want that. I want one of those. So Under Lock and Key was exactly my amp, just I did it for him. I did a 50 watt and 100 watt because they, you know, a 50 watt and 100 watt has a whole different personality. You know, 100 watts have a lot more low end. 50 watts have more sizzle top end. So when you play them together, it gets an amazing sound, right? Because it kind of, you get both the best worlds, you know. But yeah, cool. So that's what happened with George. Actually, like I said, all you know, this is really interesting. This might be useful. So I'm sitting there, and it was crazy. I mean, I'm literally every week we're working with another big, huge album. I mean, you can look it up on my website. You can see all the albums that we worked on. And so I'm, you know, at one point, I had to have a crew of people to deal with not only the rock stars, but to deal with the stuff going on around the world. Stuff was coming in. UPS was showing up with 10, 15 boxes a day from all over the world. And we had already talked to them what they wanted. It was, I was Groove Tube's largest dealer, because it was, I mean, Aspen used to show up every week with a bunch of tubes and bring them down, because we didn't want to deal with any problems with shipping an amp back to England or shipping an amp to Australia or anywhere. So you had to buy a new set of tubes with the mod. You had, you know, so it came completely tricked out, ready to go, plug it in, go, right? So, yeah, all of them came with groove tubes in them, and it was, you know, so the point is we're doing this for all these players, right? Like I said, George, Warren DeMartini, Steve Vai. Now, when you start going back, and we can go, there's a lot more than that. I'm just hitting those names. Zach Wilde, you know, Ozzy Osbourne. When you realize that everybody it gets the same stuff, but doesn't sound the same at all, because there's something in people's hands. I can go on a side note real quick. Just before he died, I was working with Randy Rhoads. Randy could play, his favorite thing was that distortion plus pedal. It didn't matter what he plugged into. He could plug into a champ and sound like him, because it's in their hands, right? It's, you know, same thing when I worked with Eddie for Uncalled Knowledge album. That's another story where I fixed his #1 amp when it blew up the first time, the one that was used on everything. And I can tell you that I sat there. We had 4 different amps, and one of them was one of my new M1000s, and I had them stacked up, all plugged in. They were on standby, and in one hand I had a guitar cord, and the other hand I had a speaker cord. And plug it in, hit the power switch, Eddie would play. I'd turn it off, click into the next one, turn on, Eddie would play. I did this on 4 different amps, and you know what? They all sounded identical with him playing in it. So there's so much that has to do with the artist, the energy that goes through them, the pickups they use. And, you know, the amplifier has a lot to do with as a vehicle, but so much has to do with the artist. I mean, it's we learned that a lot working with such a wide variety of artists, that I learned that they hear the way they hear, and you don't hear the way they hear at all. You hear the way you hear, and you should always remember that there, you can't sit there and go, well, don't you hear it that way? No, they hear it the way they hear it, and you have to, allow them to. And as long as they're getting the sound that they want to hear, be happy, because even to you, if it sounds hideous, like what you've done, you've built this beautiful piece of gear, but they've made it sound to you horrible, but they're so happy. It's like you've hit the mark, right? It's whatever makes them excited, because you don't want to tell them that, no, you're not hearing it right, because it creates them why when you hear a recording and that's so-and-so or this is so-and-so, they get their signature sound by how they hear it, right? And so anyway, enough of that. Go ahead.
Thanks. That's really useful. Lee, I'll let you over to Steve. He's got a few questions for you.
Yeah. Sure. I think a couple of my questions might ask you to go over some ground you already covered, but maybe we'll hit some different angles. But
yeah, no problem.
But this one, I think, actually gets a little deeper into something that you've been talking around, which is clearly you've got a varied career. But one thing you've worked on a lot and that you're known for is your work with modifying Marshalls. And I wondered if you could say a little more about what is it in the particular circuit design of Marshall amps that enables or complicates your efforts to modify them compared with other amps that you've worked on?
Well, in one sense, they're a great forum to work on, because they're open. Especially if you've got point to point, they're simple to get to. Circuit boards are more difficult to work on. They're actually quite they're simple. They're based on Fenders, right? And he admitted that it was based on the original Bassman.
Totally.
And Leo was more, and Leo, he just took it out of the RCA tube manual. It's not like he was changing the world, and we can get into that too with like the Dumbles, that's just his main tube stage is right out of the RCA tube manual. It was based on a circuit for stability anyway, but when you had this great option, what is interesting that made Marshalls is during this whole time, Fender was using 6L6s, and for some reason those weren't available in England. What was available to them was EL34s. Now, completely a different beast. And the transformers, Fender was impregnating their transformers with a form of tar, which was like made them a lot cleaner, and you had less core saturation. Whereas Marshall didn't do that. They used shellac, and their transformers would saturate faster. So they really fed into because Fenders generally were country, right? You plug a twin in and off you go, turn it up really loud and be clean as hell. Okay. Whereas Marshalls, as you turn them up, and it's funny because in the beginning years, they were like, oh, goddamn, these things distort, but really later years, it became their thing. But, it's very simple stage. It's forget one, like the early Marshall with 4 inputs is basically 2 half stages, then off it goes, right? So they biased each half stage, which was like 1 gain stage. And then it went into a tone circuit. Then it went into a phase inverter, which is, incredibly simple. It's like boom, boom, boom. They did their tone circuit different than Fender. Well, they did it like the original Bassman, which Fender then changed their tone circuit. But it, so in the sense of it was an open, actually a great platform to play, because there wasn't a lot going on. It's very simple. You add 1 stage, and that was a major change, right? If you changed anything in the tone circuitry, that was a major change. It was, but at the same time, like I said, when you had EL34s, that was already in the market of distortion. Now, later on, when they ran KT88s, and which is like a 6550, you know, that was a lot cleaner. It was harder to push. You know, I mean, they started using those Marshall majors and that kind of stuff because they wanted more output with lower distortion.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, there's nothing that made it difficult to modify Marshall. It really, like I said, you had plenty of open chassis. You had plenty of. I know a lot of people were angry at me because we drilled up a bunch of them, so especially those early ones, adding tubes and tube effects loops because they didn't have effects loops, right? So that was a big thing, adding tube effects loops to them because a lot of people started using during the end of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s, people started using a lot of rack effects and wanting them in the effects loops. And because it sounds better in the effects loop, right? Because if you put it in the front end, that affects the sound of your amplifier, especially if you've got a sound that you like, and all you want to do is add reverb or delay or, you know, that kind of stuff. You could put it in the effects loop. Did that help? Or was that?
Yeah, that's great. And I think there was sort of a follow-up we had in there, but I think you've already answered it. So I think,
no, go ahead, whatever.
Well, we've got plenty of other questions, believe me.
Okay.
We're not going to run out of things to ask you anytime too soon. But the next question I have actually is one I think we've covered a little. So I want to kind of ask you to kind of think a little more about some of what I've heard you say about the way your career evolved, because the way you made it sound is you already had this idea for how you wanted your equipment to work and how you wanted to sound.
Right.
And other people kind of tapped in, like George Lynch and others.
Right.
You know, was that pretty much true throughout, or was there were there any points where the musician led your efforts more in how you were modifying, like you were responding more to something that someone came to you and said, I really want this? Or was it pretty much always, it was your idea and the folks who came to you wanted what you were already offering?
I have to say yes, because I started off as a professional guitar player. I supported myself and toured. I recorded albums from when I was 18. I mean, I was very driven for myself, right? I mean, that even comes up to this day. When I design a new product, it's because I'm sitting around going, God, you know something? I want something like that. And I start playing with it. And then after I design it for me, I'll sit there and show it to somebody. Like I did, one of my really popular pedals was called Mr. Springy. It was a spring reverb pedal. The same thing. I created it for myself. Somebody came by one afternoon and said, hey, what's that? And they played it and they're like, can I have that? And it's like, well, I can build you one. And then it just, that was the first experience of selling tens of thousands of something. I never at that point had sold so much product like that pedal. But just recently I came up with an idea. I had watched a documentary on the making of No Time to Die with the soundtrack, right? And I heard Jack White's guitar sound and I was like, man, that is so cool. And I'm telling you, if he would have used a specific product, I would have just went out and bought it because, you know, I just used, you know, but I went and dug, called people, found out that he used multiple pedals plugged into each other to create that sound, right? It wasn't one thing. So that started me to start, you know, looking into it. And I pulled out my breadboard and I started breadboarding and I came up with the Bad Kitty. And I'm able to get the exact sound when you push the switch. You have two different kinds of distortions in this, but it's basically a fuzz, but it's also can be it's weird because it'll also be a distortion. So you can turn it up into fuzz, but you can back it down. But again, not to go so far into this, but this was the same thing. I wanted it, right? And then now anybody that plays this, they buy it. So it's like, it's always driven by me wanting for me as a guitar player. I just, you know, when you try, if somebody comes to you with their idea, again, I don't mean to go on a tangent, but when I went to work for Fender, there was literally only 2 guitar players in R&D, and it was me and Paul. And what they used to do is they had this big white room, I'm sure you've seen the pictures, where they would put all the instruments, amplifiers in there, and then they would call in all the rock stars and guys in their lab coats with their clipboards with already pre-made like check boxes, and then open areas going as just think of anybody at that time that was playing, that would be playing on the guitar, and they would come up to him and the guy would go, yeah, it's really chocolatey luscious. Oh, it needs, and I'm serious. They would write this stuff down and check the boxes and then go back into R&D and then sit around trying to figure out what this artist was talking about, because it's like, just pick up a guitar and play. I understand that they hired some really top-notch engineers in their field, but they weren't guitar players. And it changed when we were in there playing guitar, because we'd sit there and play and say, no, that doesn't work. This is great, and that really makes a difference on that. So for me, it didn't, in my career, it never really, the only thing that probably at one point, I forgot, I think it was Paul Gilbert came to me and said, look, can we do something so that I hit a switch and it boosts the volume up? So what I did is I made a selectable, master volume, so that he could preset 2 different master volumes and then boot, so stuff like that. And, where somebody would come to me and say, hey, can you make the mid switch foot switchable, things that were already in the system, but can we add more, another feature, make the effects foot switchable? Because some of that stuff, at the time you're not thinking about it, you're just trying to get it so that it works for them. And then obviously it makes sense to make this stuff switchable, because then you can bring stuff in and out and that kind of stuff, especially multiple channels and that, that kind of stuff. But anyway, I hope that answered that.
Yeah, right on. So moving from that, I guess, this might apply almost as much to your own playing as it does to what you've observed in others. Like, have you noticed that there are particular guitar techniques that players have used as a result of the kinds of tones that you've tried to build into the modified Marshalls that you made, or the others that have been doing similar work?
Have I tried to change the tones in my stuff?
No. How much do you see some kind of connection between the tone that comes out of the amps that you've worked on and the techniques that players have used?
Oh, well, absolutely. That's interesting, because I just 2 weeks ago I got contacted from Buckethead. You know who Buckethead is,
wow,
right?
Yeah, sure.
And he was in town, and he's like, "Hey, can we hang out?" I was like, "Sure, let's do it." And the gist of it was fun. The gist of the whole experience was, he was like, "Look, I want you to hand make me some amps from the 80s," because he got to play Paul's amps in the 80s.
Oh, right.
And they do work really well with shred. Right. And because that tack, that's again, what happens is, if you gain up the front end, that becomes mush, because the fire of each note gets stuck on a distortion, right? And it's fuzzy, and you'll lose that attack, right? And I don't play like that. I'm more, I mean, I can play fast, but I don't play shred. I play just more, classic rock stuff. But yeah, Paul and those guys that can play that stuff. And same thing with Buckethead. They, for the longest time, I was like, I never seen Paul and Buckethead in the same room. No.
I've seen that speculation online.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, I hung out with him all afternoon with no mask, and it's not Paul.
Okay. You can prove it. I didn't actually think they were the same person, but it's
Well, they look the same they're both skinny. They're both, they both, Paul's got shorter hair now, but that one time they both had really long hair.
I think Paul Gilbert gave Buckethead lessons, right? I think he had a few lessons earlier.
Oh no, Buckethead got a lot of lessons from him. He, oh, absolutely. He definitely digs Paul Gilbert, but that, but yeah, so to answer your question, absolutely certain amps create, I worked like on my latest amp, I originally in the 80s came out with the M1000 under the Metatronics name. And then for the longest time, I did a bunch of different other amps, Lee Jackson amps and Master Series stuff. And then plus designing for Ampeg and that kind of stuff. But then about 5 years ago, I got a lot of email from people going, why aren't you doing another Metaltronics? And I sat down and came up with a new design. And one of the things that I worked on in that design was to speed up what you call the slew rate, which is the recovery time of the attack, right? And that makes a big difference when you're playing fast, right? Because it'll actually feel like there's fire under your fingers because it's not decaying and taking a while to come back. So in that style, I did change the design to make it more to be able to accept that kind of playability. Because for me, it worked. Hey, if I'm playing fast and it feels like it's on fire, I love it. Rather than dull, right? I don't want it to sound dull or feel dull, or you know what I'm saying, or because that also works. It's interesting because I've had the gamut of people. I just got contacted this last year from Metallica telling me they used my amp on 4 of this last album, and it was really kind of them. They even did a promo shot where they stacked my amps behind them, and
nice.
It was which is a total different style than anybody else, right? It's it's got that edge and fire to it, and so as long as it performs, that's really all you're asking for, right? Is that it fits in that genre. But yeah, that's about it. Is that I've tweaked a couple little things to if I can make them a little better, then I do it. If the bottom line is it's got to sound great for me. It just has to have a great sound. But yeah, anyway, hope that helped out.
Yeah, right on. I think I'm going to pass things back over to Austin now.
Sure, Steve. Yeah. I think again, Lee, with these questions and your introductory discussion, you've probably touched on some of these subjects. So we'll rewind back a little bit, and it's
totally fine.
It's cool, and I think the question is around talking about the kind of community and the culture around modding. Would you say, and you can talk about, be particularly interested about that time back in the Sunset Strip and maybe interactions with other modders such as Jose, or just that general community. Was there a sense of sharing, or was there a sense of community there, and that shaped your work?
Not at all. It was, Hollywood. Everything was, absolutely, nobody talked to anybody, and it was because everybody. I mean, George was really upset with me when I did Warren Underlock and Invasion of Privacy.
Oh yeah, right.
Invasion of Privacy. He was like, how could you do that? It's like he called me and asked me. Because in the beginning, these guys are like, you're their secret weapon, right? Because they want to have something that the other guy doesn't have, right? And no, it was no community. It was, first off, remember, no internet, so nobody's communicating with each other. We didn't have cell phones; we had phones. My communication with people was either by letter or they called us, right? So there would be, the artists were all talking to each other. That was the big network. Everybody's talking to each other in Hollywood, and then everybody's getting their album deals, and then they find out that you built their equipment for that album. They heard the album, they're like, oh God, you know, it's all that competition to not be your album sucking, right? I mean, that was really the way that was happening at the time. I mean, yeah, you know, there wasn't people. No, there was, everybody was looking at, same thing with the trade shows. When we were doing trade shows, everybody was very secretive. Everybody did not want anybody to know what you were doing, because you basically had your little market, and you know, whatever you were doing to pay your employees and keep your whole thing going. It You know, that's what's kind of ruined what's happened now, is with the internet having everything out there, people are taking everything. And yes, some people have taken some stuff and created some creative things out of it, but the majority is not like that. The majority is just, you know, even big companies now are just taking everybody's designs, and what I've noticed is that it's kind of ruined the creative market, because you don't actually want to create anything new, because it's like, well, that'll get stolen. You know, I mean, it's like that kind of has ruined the community of people, you know, exchanging ideas. Now, if there's artists that are trying to create something for themselves, like those companies that make pedals that you can make yourself and that kind of stuff, where they're saving money, I think that's awesome, you know. But what happens is somebody starts thinking that it's a business, and they go directly after somebody that was actually the designer of the product, and then they make a product just like it, and they might be better off in social than the actual company. And that stuff, it's really sad, because the guy who actually did all the work and created it, you know, loses. And so it's a kind of a interesting edge on the community thing.
Mm.
And if we just stick back in the, you know, the 80s again, were you was there any kind of like cross influence between yourself and Jose or any other modders? Were you aware of what he was doing and vice versa? How did that work?
I was aware of what he was doing, because I would get his stuff would come in, because he had been doing it for years. So stuff would come in. We were also a repair shop, right? So we were repair a bunch of stuff. So his stuff would come in. I would see what he was doing. And like I said, I saw what it was he was adding gain to the front ends of the stuff. And I was really happy with what was going on with me. So he wasn't, you know, we kind of coexisted in a market, because the guys that wanted his stuff, and the guys that wanted my stuff wanted mine. So we both had a flourishing business, and you know, there wasn't anybody else in Hollywood at the time. I mean, nobody else that was. There was only two places. Me, and that went in a lot of ways. You know, when we go work on a big album, there was only one drum guy. There was only one bass guy. You know, I'm saying that brought in bass rigs and tune systems, and you know, I mean, we all started knowing each other, because we were all going into the same gigs, right? And so it was an interesting time. It changed, you know, the internet changed all of it, right? Because as soon as the schematics started hitting the market, then all of a sudden everybody became a specialist, right? Because they could copy a schematic and build a product. And now there's this offshoot doing whatever of amps, pedals, you name it, based on schematics that became available on the internet. And it was pretty wide. There was a lot of companies that came and went, but they built a lot of product there for a little while, and you know, got a name for themselves, but then didn't make it. But you know, they did it from schematics. So yeah, there wasn't 80s Hollywood was an interesting time. I mean, you know, we were kind of celebrities in the field that we were in. I mean, we were first call, you know, just like the first call guitar player, we were the first call to anything that was on the next big album. And you know, same thing for live touring acts. they would come through, and we get called to build them stuff for the tours. Also, we built 3 of the most popular amps for Andy Brower that were rented for. If we weren't personally working on the album, they were renting it from Andy Brower to use on a bunch of albums. Yeah, I mean, ton of product. And so, they were, same thing. He had Jose amps too. So whatever anybody wanted to rent, they could rent a Jose, they could rent one of mine. But you didn't hear about anybody else out there. I'm just saying, during the 80s, it was an interesting time. It was amazing how busy we were. It was pretty much go, go, go. And the thing that's sad is we didn't have video cameras then. We only had motion picture cameras. Mm. You would have to either bring one of those or bring an AGFA or whatever, the recorder, if you wanted to film anything, because I could have filmed all those top albums, because we worked on so many of them. And but never, I got pictures, but I didn't get a lot of no video footage, and I didn't take a lot of pictures because I didn't want to be that guy. Hey, hold on, can we take you know what I'm saying? So we got some pictures, but we didn't take a lot of pictures. But yeah, no, it was I know now there's a lot more of a community out there. I'm not part of it because I'm on the end of this. I'm phasing my field out. I'm getting to the point now that it's like music is not the same anymore. Everything is changing. Modelers, come on. There's no comparison of modeler and a tube amp.
We'll get to that later.
Yeah. Right.
I understand, but all that stuff has changed for me, how I look at the industry. But anyway,
can I ask, Lee? I've never been able to kind of find this information myself. Outside of Hollywood, are you aware of any other modders around the States or even globally that was kind of doing something similar at that time?
At that time? No, I think there was a couple of cats in England, and I can't remember their names, but I remember hearing that there was a couple of guys out there that were building stuff for the guys on the other side of the pond. But in the United States, not by as busy as we were, is that we, like I said, I couldn't even keep up. I went from 2 employees to 12 employees pretty quick, just trying to keep up with the demand of product coming in for us to build, and that was stuff every day. We had a room with just stuff stacked up coming in boxes, and then going through the system, and then UPS would show up and back out, it would go. But yeah, because we tried to get stuff turned around as fast as possible. But no, I didn't know of any. I'm sorry, but I don't mean to be tunnel vision, but
that's fine. It seems to substantiate what we found. It doesn't seem like there was a massive amount of modders at that time, which is really interesting.
No, it was quiet.
Yeah, can you? Again, you've touched on this one. Your expertise in modding Marshalls, that developed, really, developed your reputation amongst other technicians and musicians. Did you find, you mentioned about Briar Rentals, did it get to the stage where people were maybe asking for a Lee Jackson modified Marshall, over a Jose? Was your reputation such that guitar players and musicians were really familiar with your work and your sound and what your mod could offer them?
Absolutely. I'm like in Guitar Player magazine every week. It was, one of the first, later on, there was an article with me and Soldano talking about when we first, because that was at the point where we started building our own amps. I had the Metaltronix M1000 and he had his amp, and that was on the early talking about. So during that time, Mike was coming up, and was, he came out with his amps, around the mid late 80s kind of a thing. So he was definitely in there. I wasn't hearing of him like taking away any mod work, but definitely my name's on the back of all these albums. They started realizing that it's my stuff that was being used, and like I said, I was being interviewed all the time, and we're starting to run ads in all the major magazines. Basically, I would run, especially after I started getting all the big stars, I'd run these ads where it would be all the top guitar players, boom, 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 boom. Why are they sound the best? Boom, big Metaltronix ad. It's like, because with my name signature along with it. So it wasn't just Metaltronix, it was Lee Jackson Metaltronix. And yeah, I mean, we were running, I was one of the first companies that was running major radio ads in Hollywood on KNAC. We sponsored the whole heavy metal hour. I mean, it was awesome. We were everywhere. We were running billboards down on Hollywood Boulevard, right there at the Roxy. There's a book out there about the Hollywood scene that's got one of my billboards in it.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, we were pushing. I mean, I was pushing big time. So yeah, it was, I had a crew I had to pay, I had to make sure this thing was going, and, we were having a blast. I mean, come on, we got to work on the biggest names albums in history during that time. It's like one after another. It was fun. Plus, one of the things I discovered is if the artist is pursuing you, they're really nice. They're always really nice. You just never want to pursue an artist, because then they treat you like you're, but when they're pursuing you, everybody can be nice to each other, and it's a great environment. Everybody's happy. Anyway, without going down more stories, go ahead. Where's your next question?
Yeah, that's great, Lee. We can have another follow-up interview in your experiences in Sunset Strip in the 80s, but we'll keep that for another time.
No problem.
I'll hand you over to Steve for the last couple of questions.
Yeah. Sure. So I wanted to ask to maybe broaden the scope a little bit and think about how you see Marshall modifications of the sort that you've done and that others have done. How much do you see them having influenced other kinds of amp designs that have followed?
How did it influence amps?
Yeah.
Oh, well, it majorly influenced amps. It influenced Marshall. I mean, I was scaring the bejesus out of Marshall, because we were literally number 2 in the world at the time. We were running full page ads against Marshall. Marshall was running. We had more of the major rock stars. I mean, Marshall's got a lot of people, but we had all the current biggest names in the world were playing our stuff, and so it affected them big time. I don't know if you. Metaltronix had Built to Blast on our shirts, and which was a playoff on Built to Last, right? Okay. And Marshall runs an ad against us, so you're scaring them, with a hand grenade in the middle of the page saying, "It doesn't have to be loud to be good." And it's like, I'd laugh. It's like, okay, because, so you started seeing them started changing. They started adding gain. They started changing their models, because, all the way to the point of last year where they're literally taking some of the top mods that have happened over the years, and they're putting them in models right now. You can actually get certain models that are basically modified Marshalls. And so obviously we impacted them in a big way, so that they, feel that they had to do that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of amp companies came in the future because they saw a market. Like I said, at one point I got tired of people constantly going, wow, that guy, I saw so-and-so last night. What a great sounding Marshall. Because I wasn't one of those guys that put my name on the box. You know, like there's some guys that'll put their name on the box so that you know that it's modified. I mean, my signature would be on the back of the amp, but not, you know, not anywhere in the front. So that's when I got really burnt out on I was going, you know what, I got to do my own amp. I gotta start creating my own field, which worked out great because it was just that perfect timing. I mean, we were selling a lot of amps, and so it was perfect timing to release an amplifier. So once you know, people start seeing that, they see you at the trade shows, other companies start going, wow, you know, I want a piece of that market. So they start pointing their stuff more towards distortion. They start changing the sounds of their product to fit more of what the market wants, right? Because you know, for the longest time we had a pretty good rock market, you know, progressive market. You know, as it changed, grunge market, that was a little different because that was based more on pedals. Because that became a whole pedal market, which was really interesting, you know. Which, you know, that's a whole different sound, right? And then it kind of comes around again for a little while, and then we go into modeling. But anyway, right.
Well, we're going to get to that soon. But I want to ask you, you know, because you clearly yourself moved more and more into doing your own stuff, right? And
right, exactly, right.
how would you describe the relationship between a Metaltronix amp and the Marshalls that you were modifying, or the other amps that had your actual signature on them in the front, and the amps that you were doing that were kind of modifying other people's designs?
So what I did with, like, okay, so when I came out with the M1000, in a sense, it had both styles. I put gain on the front end, I put gain on the output, and you could turn them on and off with the amp had a lot of switching on it, a lot of controls that you pushed and pulled. So yeah, so what I tried to do is I wanted to design something that would you couldn't put yourself in a situation that you didn't find it worked, right? So like I said, I put gain in the front end, I put gain in the back end, I put, you know, switchable effects loops, I put, you know, there was a, like I said, that thing I did for Paul where there was a master volume that you could preset and hit a button and blast, you know, because that was a problem is, you know, adding more distortion doesn't make an amp louder. It just makes it fuzzier. The only way you're going to get an amp louder is by turning up the output stage, right? So I did that on, anyway. Yeah. So like, you know, when I went to work for Ampeg, you know, they had set things that they wanted, right? They wanted reverb, which I always hate putting reverb in amplifiers. And they wanted, you know, multiple channels. They wanted, you know, that kind of stuff. So, you know, obviously that was a ground up design for them that was new. I hadn't put out anything like that before, which was the VL series, and which was very popular for Ampeg, and it still is. I mean, they don't make them, but they built a lot of them that are out there, and they're great. They're great sounding product because they're really versatile. They can go from a super clean sound to a super distorted sound, you know. But anyway, hope that helped that out. Answer.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're now ready to get to that question we keep dancing around, which is, how do you see the future of the kind of modifications that you're known for, and the broader community of people who've worked on those evolving in light of the rise of digital modeling technologies and amp simulators?
Meaning,
well, do you think amp sims are gonna? You've made it clear that you think there's no real comparison between digital modeling and like working really with the guts of an amp. So maybe you could start by just elaborating on that. Why do you think those are two such different things?
Well, first off, when you listen, okay, you put a mic up, because mics are it's one thing when you play a live gig, things go by, people don't notice. Put a mic on something, right, where you scrutinize it, and you will find that the modeling amp is 2D. It's not 3D. It has no depth. It has a width, and it has this, sound that sounds like close to what it's modeling, right? But it has there's no soul. There's no depth to it. There's no 3D depth to it. Whereas, they have that same thing going on with really expensive studio gear, right? Same thing you have with plugins. I do a lot of studio work, and we're all trying to get that plugin, which a plugin is a modeler. And the problem is that especially when you're working with let's go back to amps, tubes, and you're working with transformers, you basically got lightning in a bottle, and you're dealing with extremely high voltages. And when you hit a string, you're moving tremendous energy, and you're moving energy through an amplifier, going down into your speaker, and it's moving. It's a lot of energy.
Mm.
A modeling amp is running on 12 volts. It's your headroom, like even if you got a plus or minus system, say let's go high, 30 volts, right? One tube stage, just the first tube stage, you're well over 60 volts when you hit a string. Boom. Okay. And it just keeps getting more and more as it gets out to you got a plate voltage of 450, 475 volts. You are moving so much energy, and that transformer is doing so many different things.
Mm.
They try to model it. See, they're riding a wave of, they can't go too deep because the program would be so heavy. The delay, the delay of when you hit a string and the sound comes out would be so long, it'd be unusable. Mm. And the amount of computer power that it would take to emulate that thing that you're emulating, right? Because not only are you having to emulate the transformer, you're having to emulate the tubes. Then you have to emulate how each thing works at each little bit, right? If you hit it with a light guitar string or you hit it with a heavy guitar string, so many different things are changing that if they emulated each part, like I said, now in the future, when like they just announced the new chips for next year that are supposedly 1,000 times faster than what's available this year. Mm. We'll get to the point where the computer will have a much better job of being able to emulate stuff, faster, more actions. But right now, there's no comparison. It sounds okay. They're fun to play, like in your bedroom. They're fun to play a live gig with because there's so much stuff going on that people are not sitting there being critical and listening. But as for recording an album, you're going to be really critical listening to it and going, because the difference, if you listen to a tube amp against even a solid state amp or original one, you're going to hear a difference in depth and reality to a modeling. Like I said, I mean, they're easy to play. They're super distorted. The other thing that I will say that's really disappointing, and that is now everybody sounds the same. Mm. Everybody that uses that stuff. Mm. They all have this same, it's a great heavy, I mean, you can get an amazing heavy tone out of a modeler amplifier, right? It sounds like God coming down. Like, it sounds like a multi-tracked recording. Do you know what I'm saying? Mm. Out of a single modeler just playing through it, right? It's got this heavy sound. The problem with that is, like I said, is when I hear a modern day guitar player, there's no way you can pick them out. You can't go, oh, that's so-and-so, or that's, because remember, when you heard Jimmy Page, you know who he was, you knew who Jeff Beck was, you knew who Zakk Wylde was, you knew who, George Lynch was. When you heard that recording, you went, oh, that's so-and-so. But now it's all the same sound. And that's the downside of these modelers, is that, I know it's easy. I know, and it's a drag. Tube amps, just to give you an idea, I had this conversation with a local artist here. He's a blues player. He brought me some of his Tweed amps, Fenders, to go over. And I said to him, I said, do you have a collection of tubes? You know, NOS tubes. And he looked at me in shock. I said, you know, you need to have, if you want your amp to stay sounding the way it sounds, is, you know, there's no comparison to an old NOS tube. I mean, a new old stock, not an old tube, but a new old stock, to a new tube. I said they're suffering from the same problem. It's amazing sound difference if you change the tube out.
Yeah.
And he was like, no. So we go looking for him, and you know, a GE 12AX7 right now is $175.
Whoa.
Okay, a GE 6L6 is $150 each, and a black plate is almost $200 on a same thing with the black plate 12AX7, 200 each. You know, a set of Sylvania 60A7s is $1,000 a quad, and that's a deal if you can find them. Okay, so think about it. Hey, we're going to change your tubes in your amp. That's going to be about $1,400. You know, it's like just changing tubes. And to finish that idea off, so that, you know, there was being in the studio world too, there was a guy that recently took two Telefunken mics, an original one, totally original NOS, and a new one that just was available. And he did the unthinkable. I give him credit. Is he literally took parts off he first listened to them both, noticed there was a drastic difference in both of them. And then he took parts off of the vintage one and kept changing them out on the new one and testing it. Sound, test, 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 test. The thing that made the biggest change, and it was amazing, you can find this on the YouTube, is when he changed the EF86 out, the tube. Because they do make new EF86s, but the difference is, one, the angels sing and the flowers bloom, and the new one is like, it's there. It's just there. So the same thing happens with tube amplifiers and studio tube gear. It's, you know, at some point it's going to be all over, right? And there's only going to be modeling, because, you know, it's sad. It's sad that whatever the magic that was, and I guess it's because it was really dangerous the way they used to make tubes, and people died, and, you know, that kind of stuff. And Aspen Pittman found that out when he bought, I think it was either the GE factory or the RCA factory, one of the factories he bought, because he was going to make his own tubes. And then the EPA stamp came in and said, no, you're not. And he started buying the guts from Sovtech and then bringing them into California and finishing them off. But, you know, that's the truth on the modeling, is that at some point, and they're not there yet. And there's also, when they're there yet, one of the things in it, it's amazing how people have gotten used to this, is latency. When you strike that string and it comes out of the speaker, remember, in an amplifier, it's there, boom. It moves through the amp, lightning, boom, speaker. Through a modeler, it goes in, it calculates, the computer runs, and then it outputs a signal. And it takes a certain amount of time from the time you strike that string, even if it's great, even if they've got the best code in the world, it still has to calculate before it plays a note. And what's happening is people are getting used to that, you know, long delay in playing, which is, that's not something you want to train yourself into playing. You know what I'm saying? That decay. So that's the things that I'm sorry for the modeler people. It's, you know, it's easy. It's great to practice with. It's great to put ideas down with. But if you're going to record your #1 album that you're excited about, pull the amp out and mic it up, because it's going to be you're going to be much happier in the way that it sits in the mix. It's, you know, maybe in the future, I don't know, you know, we're not there yet, but maybe in the future the modelers will get better. I mean, because if you just listen to it on the outside, it sounds great. You pull a chord, bang, it's got this blend, and you hear all these people playing all this amazing stuff, and definitely death metal, right? There's like, man, they've got, because you can't even, there's a sound that you can get on a modeler you can't even get on a tube amp, and that's that really hard edge, because it's solid state, and it's non-giving, and it's heavy, right? It works, but most of the time they're playing a tube bass amp to roll the edges of the overall recording. Do you know what I'm saying? So they've got this, they're playing through an SVT to get their bass tone, which has got this wonderful round edge to it. And then they'll hit it with a modeler amp, just cracking on the edge. And it's an interesting blend. It's a different sound. And again, who's to say if that's your sound and you're happy with it? That's where we come back full circle again. The bottom line is, if you're excited and you love that sound, then you've won. That's really what it matters. I mean, everybody's got their own opinion. I mean, it's easy to say, well, this is better or that's better. All I know, like I said, is that once all the tubes are gone, not only is the amp market going to suffer, but the high-end studio market's going to suffer big time, because all those coveted, 670s, and which uses 22 tubes in it, and all these, things that use a lot of tubes, they're all going to be like, uh-oh, because they don't sound the same. And I'm sorry, but they just don't. And I've proven that to people. I went to the studio and I brought a little box of all NOS, new in box, RCAs and GEs, and they were playing, they were recording, and I had told them ahead of time. I said, I'm going to bring some tubes, right? And they were like, they didn't believe it. How, they've got this great sound. Okay, and all I did was unplug their 12X7s, and I popped in these NOS 12X7s, let it warm up, and they played, and they just looked at me and were like, "You're kidding me." It all of a sudden had this 3D dimension more, and it's a tube amp, and it's even more dimension than it had with the tubes that were in it. So,
Wow.
I know, that's depressing. It's like, I guess get all your recording in, or buy up whatever like I told this artist here.
Yeah, right.
I said, pull out some cash and go buy some tubes while they're still around, and put them away, because in a sense it's probably even better than gold, because if you've got, let me tell you, if you've got vintage EF86s, and say in 20 years there's not even one available, and you've got a major studio, it's like, what price is it? Like, how much you want this? Because you have a microphone that costs $20,000 that's worth nothing right now because the tube is dead, right? It's like, I got an EF86 NOS, it's like, whatever the price is, you could, especially if you had rich people bidding against each other, it would be worth whatever they're going to do, But anyway, what's the next question?
Well, we're getting towards the end of our questions, but I wanted to ask you if there's anyone that you think is working now, either in modifying or maybe even modeling, although it sounds like you're a little more skeptical there, who you really see as pointing the way towards some future developments that you think have a lot of promise.
Well, I think what's happening now is we're seeing a financial war, and that is it's a price-driven market.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with the price-driven market is that it is hard to make something really exceptional for nothing, and we saw it with the Chinese market. We've seen it, them getting into, perfect example is they knock off all the super high-end studio gear. It's not even close. I know, because I use this stuff in the studio, and I'll go to a studio that's got some of this Chinese knockoffs, 1176s, LA2As, all that stuff, and it ain't close. It sounds good. It sounds okay. But if you, again, once you compare it to a real product, it's a different market. So I think I'm seeing what I'm seeing is people just trying to make cheaper and cheaper and cheaper product. Um, I and I get it, because the biggest thing that we're seeing is there's no more guitar heroes. And the only positive side that we're seeing is that there's starting to be more women guitar heroes that we never saw before, right? So we're seeing, that's actually stepping up. That's, because for the longest time we didn't see that. We only saw guys doing that. The other thing is that somebody brought up to me the other day, which was a great point, is that just like you were saying, so we've been making, as an industry, let's just even say the 50s, 40s, 50s, right? We've been making product heavily industrialized, amplifiers, guitar effects, and guitars, okay? For all these years, making as much product as you can even imagine. And unless there's a fire, a flood, or a natural disaster, it's still on the earth. All of it. Every Fender, every Marshall, every Hi-Watt, every, Mesa Boogie, and just like this huge collection that I helped with years ago, this guy just dumped it in the market. He had one of everything, the best you've ever, like tags still on tweed Fenders and Marshalls, and what I'm saying, and that all just got dumped into the market. Beautiful product, like original tubes, original everything, all in just amazing, shape. So there's so much product out there, right? That, and because of the huge market of pedals, huge market of pedals has really taken off, right? So you can actually use anything, right? If you got a great pedal that has a really good sound to it, you can use anything that's a power amp or a clean sound, or any kind of, an old Fender or a new Fender, anything you can get a sound out of it and get through your gig, and it'll sound great. So what that has hurt is that new sales, and everybody I talk to is a lot of companies are singing their death knell right now. You're hearing, I'm not going to say any names, but there's people that are starting to talk about that they're going to be closing their doors. And it's because you're not seeing that huge number of product that you used to see, right? You don't see it. I mean, I see it in my own thing. I mean, the emails are not like they used to be. I mean, it used to be you almost needed a staff to take care of just the emails coming in. And that's not happening anymore. And it just, everything has slowed down so drastically, because the music scene has slowed down so drastically. And it's, and you're seeing most of the recordings right now are modeling amplifiers, like not even amplifiers, plugins, right? I mean, plugin market is massive. It's those guys, there's those guys out of Germany that make some really good plugins, right? That sound like well recorded. Again, it's 2D sounding, but they're the best in that field, and it's working out great, and they're getting great sounds, and people, when it turns out that your bottom line to this whole thing is an MP3, okay, you're not going to be as critical as if you're listening to an album or listening to a high-res 48K recording. MP3 is such a limited frequency response that, all this stuff out here that you're worried about, that you're creating all this great low end and high end, it's not even in the recording, right? So people have gotten so used to that, and they've trained themselves to be happy with that we're seeing the market change. And, you're seeing some of these older artists, and some young guys are going back to tape recording, right? Desks, no Pro Tools, going in 2-inch tape and recording the album, and then outputting that to a vinyl album. Yeah, that's a whole nother experience, right? Than doing the modern day recording. And you're seeing there's people that care, there's other people they don't care at all. They just want to get their product out, they're recording it in their bedroom, and they're doing great work. I'm not going to take away, the work that they're doing. I'm just saying is it's a different market. And I don't know what the future. I would love to like get put 50 years in advance right now, just like I wake up, 50 years and go trip around, and it's like, what's going on? Where did it go to? Right. I mean, because we hadn't even touched upon the AI thing. And, and I'll talk about real quick. So this is artist I work with out in St. Louis, and I've worked with him over time, and interesting, kind of a pop country artist. And he calls me up and he says, okay, while I'm on the phone, I'm going to send you something, email. I want you to listen to it while we're on the phone and tell me what you think. So he sends me this track. I fire it up and I'm listening to it. And I have to say, it sounds like the best hit song recording. It needed a little tweak mastering, which I did for him, but it didn't. That's just a little bit more polish. But just the way it sounded absolutely amazing. Great guitar playing, great everything. And he's laughing and he goes, Lee, what I did is I paid one of those high-end services where you pay the end column. He goes, what you do is you input the lyrics and you input the framework of what you want, like verse, chorus, pre-chorus, that kind of stuff. And he goes, and then you tell it the genre. And he said, I told it country, jazz, rock, and funk. I said, you're kidding me. He goes, no. And then it chewed away and it kicked this out. And actually, it was so amazing that I sent it to Kelly, Eric Johnson's engineer.
Oh.
And then he played it for Eric. And Eric's words were, it's over, isn't it? Because it's not just kind of good, it's absolutely amazing. And I said, did you tell it to do the passing notes on the guitar, all the cool licks? Because it had dobro and all this stuff. And he goes, nope, all I did was tell it the framework, and it put this together. And at the end of it, he has full licensing and stems that he can send to me, that I can do a mix on the stems and make, just to make it that one click more, have it go through some tubes,
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? Just to make it sound a little bit better than I'm just saying, we're at this point now that this AI thing, and we're only in the beginning. This is just child's play. We haven't even started by next year. And again, without getting, I have an old Metaltronix employee that became he owns a movie company out in Hollywood. And I talked to him recently, and he told me that by next year, there's not going to be any humans in the creation of the new movies. That the people in it will be generated. The movie will be generated. There will not be humans other than the ones on the outside, like setting up the format. And that he goes, they're already doing it in commercials. You're just not noticing it. But there's no humans that are in the commercial. If you really start looking at them, you'll start questioning it, going, oh, well, I see. But yeah, I mean, as I'm saying, not to go on a tangent, but we're seeing in music, this is going to affect music, because if art, artists will play for the art, no question. But how much time can they spend on it if it's not making them any form of a living, right? I mean, it's nice if we all have, huge bank accounts that allow us just to be creative. But if you've got to go out and perform or sell product, or, you know what I'm saying? And there's like this guy in St. Louis told me, okay, I'm going to do 10 of these and we'll release an album. So I'll send them to you. And And it was so good. I mean, it wasn't just kind of good. It sounded like a hit song. Like it was. And yes, did he write these great lyrics? Absolutely. He did that. He wrote these great lyrics, which makes it a hit song, right? Because the story is captivating, as it,
Right.
But I think that that's all part of the same thing that we're experiencing here with the music scene. It's the same, it's all driven. Like one last thing in Hollywood, what used to happen, because we were part of the whole ecosystem, is the rock stars and all the big, because we also did all the big session guys on all the TV shows and movies. They would get these huge budgets every year, and every year they'd get a whole custom rig built every year. And it was wild because the next year they'd want another custom rig. We're like, but your last rig sounds amazing. I know, just we got the budget. So then they would sell that rig to the next tier artist in Hollywood, and we'd build them this new rig, right? And then the same thing went the next year. This second tier would sell their rig to the third tier artist, and the first tier moved it to the, you know what I'm saying, to the second tier. And that would feed this market, right, of keeping incredible gear, available. So anyway, it's kind of, we're not seeing that, and it'll be interesting to see. I'd like to read when you finally put your report together what you find, and I'd like to hear what you find out of all of this.
Do you think, just going back to AI, Lee, have you any experience with any of the kind of, the kind of capture technology like Kemper and the Tonex stuff that kind of
Absolutely
uses? Do you think that's got any? Is that going to be the future, a more sophisticated version of that, or do you think the AI will be something that will be driving amp technology forward in the future?
I think. Well, okay, I'm familiar with Tonex. I have it. I played with it because I bought their big package. It came with that, and I've done samples with it, trying it out, just because I want to be informed on it. The problem with like Tonex and somewhat with Kemper's better, but with Tonex, it just takes one snapshot. Bip, that's it. Your tone, it has tone controls. They do nothing. They're a standardized tone. It's not the tone control of that amplifier. It is they do a blip through the amp, and then they give you these tone controls that are like on the outside of the thing, right? So you get this idea, because as you noticed, you can't turn the gain down. There's nothing. It's just the sound. Like they just did the Eddie Van Halen Brown sound, right? That just came out, right? So if you use it exactly the way they got it, the one sound, you play through it, it sounds exactly like that. You can't tweak anything, right? It's not like what you'll see in the future. Now, I know that Kemper, they have you changing the tone controls, and so it does get different curves. Now, it all depends on how many. Like, think about it. To truly get it, you'd have a volume control that you'd go to 1, and then you'd test every bass all the way, and then back, and then every mid. And because think of all the different selections you have between mids and gains, and you know what I'm saying, like a real amplifier, because they're just catching snapshots of it. Now, AI in the future, when they really start modeling individual components, you'll get more interaction, like a true interaction between the parts. And the cool thing is they will have vintage gear to use as a, to put the bar against. You know what I'm saying? Because that's one of the cool things about future digital is they have analog to just, pull out of storage and go, let's hear the difference. But right now it's not there. It's like I said, it's a snapshot. And if that snapshot works for you, that's far out. Like, if you have one sound and it works for you, then that's great. But if you want something that's got all the tweakability, it's not there yet. It's not there to have, like if you had a real amp sitting in front of you and you were adjusting all the different controls, you're not going to have that right now with digital. In the future, you will, but I don't know how long that's going to be, you know. But you know, like I said, I commend the Tonix guys. You know, the snapshot thing's working really well. I mean, I listened to the whole Van Halen thing, and it does sound like his process sound. Again, that's his process. It sounds like his finished sound. It doesn't sound like what's coming out of the amp. It sounds like what his process sound, which works. I mean, it's a great sound, you know.
Just last question from me, Lee, and it's connected to this. Have you found any customers that have got these Kemper profiles or Tonix profiles off your amps, your Metatronics amps, or the Lee Jackson modded amps, coming back to you then asking for a real amplifier? Have you found any of that occurring?
We you know, there is, like, you know, speaking of Kempers, there is a bunch of models of my stuff. And, you know, people sell them, you know, with all the Lee Jackson models and the Metaltronix models. But no, they would just buy one. You know what I'm saying? Is that I am finding people that use Kempers, and then when they go in the studio, they you know, they go, oh, I want to use a real amp, because, you know, it doesn't sound the same. Like I said, it sounds very one-dimensional. It's just like a flat curtain. It's big and wide. It's, you know, big, but it doesn't have like this whole movement and depth, and it just doesn't. It's a different sound. But, you know, who knows? I mean, it does. Any of this stuff helps just keeping my name out there, because people, if they see it on a Kemper, or they see it on this modeler, or what's the other guys, that, or the other DSP company, you know, if they see somebody doing it and selling, you know, putting it out there, just, there's people that might not have heard of me that see it on that and go, oh, you know, let's check that out, you know. And again, if it gets what you're looking for, then that's all that really matters. It really is. It's as long as you're happy with it, and don't listen to anybody else if you like it, you know. that's what I say. You know, if you're happy, you're happy.
Brilliant. Excellent. Okay. I think I've got all my questions covered. Steve, have you got any closing questions for Lee?
Steve, are you there?
I'm not going to say you muted, but you're muted, Steve.
I know. I had just muted myself very recently and then totally spaced. But I mean, we covered a lot of ground. I mean, I have questions I would want to get into, but I almost feel like they're grounds for a second interview, because it's
okay.
Stuff that's more like in your broader career as an amp designer and such, which is really beyond the purview of what this interview was designed to be about. So I think we've got a lot to work with here. You've been a really generous interview subject, you know.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope I didn't talk too much.
Oh no, absolutely. No, I mean, that's one of the things.
Yeah, an interviewee who doesn't talk at all is the worst. Like,
yeah, as they stare.
You're an amazing storyteller. You've got great stories to tell and a lot of great insights too. So no, this was great.
Oh, I mean, we could do a whole just storyteller. You know, when I showed up, you know, I got called by Steve Veit at Eat 'em and Smile, right? I showed up with my crew and set up the two amps, and Ted Templeton and David Lee Roth were sitting there with their arms crossed, staring at me like, you know, impress me. And Steve, you can see, is nervous because they've been for the last 2 weeks trying to do it with his Carvins, and that wasn't happening. And, so at the time, I made this little splitter box, which was active. So I plugged into the two amps and took the guitar cord and handed it to Steve, and he starts playing, and Ted Templeton and David Lee Roth jump straight up in the air and start screaming excitement. And David pulls out a wad of $100 bills and starts giving them to my crew. I'm like, hey, what about me? No, just kidding. I'm happy. I'm happy they were, you know, he was so excited. He was like, yes, we can finish the album. It's like, yep, so it's stuff like that, which was really fun. And I got more David stories, but he really, and both David and Eddie were sweethearts to me. I never had any situation of any kind that people, I hear stories, it's like they were all nice, but yeah, there was a lot of that every week. Really fun stuff. But
Great.
anyway,
We got to do a research project on the Sunset Strip at some point.
Oh yeah, the Sunset Strip. Yeah, that was, they came in through the bathroom window. That was everything you can think about the Sunset Strip was true. I mean, the girls, the parties, the Hollywood, it was absolutely insane. And I'm so glad I was part of it, because remember, I was part of it in the 70s playing on the Sunset Strip. I came right out of high school in a band that was popular, and we were playing all along all the different places in Hollywood, and it was crazy. I mean, that was like the best time in Hollywood. It was safe. Everybody thought it wasn't safe. It was really safe, and just a lot of people were involved in the whole music scene, and fun. A lot of crossover.
Sorry, go on. Finish what you were going to say, Lisa.
I was going to say a lot of crossover to the movie industry too.
Oh yeah, sure.
Can I just ask one question? I think I've asked all participants this, but I'd like to ask you just to get so we can get an understanding of the kind of evolution of guitar amps, specifically sort of higher gain amps. So obviously we kind of start off with the Marshalls, and we end up somewhere where we are now with all sorts of different amplifiers and lots of gain. How would you trace that kind of lineage? Just if you give us a little whistle stop sort of milestone tour of that evolution. And obviously you're a big part of it, but we'd be interested to branch out a little bit more to get an understanding of that.
Well, we and I was in the forefront of this too, was the rack mount preamps, right? Tube preamps, because I was the first guy to put out a high-end rack mount tube preamp, because nobody even thought about it. I took the idea from the super high-end stereo. They were already doing stuff like that. So you started with the very basic, like you're saying, the very basic of amplifiers that just brought the pickup up of a solid, not a solid body, but a big body guitar. Then you rolled into solid body guitars. Les Paul started rolling into bigger amps. You had Gibson amps, Fender amps. Same thing. Again, we're like you're saying, those early amps were cathode biased, so they distorted earlier, so they started getting more power, especially for bass. You move it into cathode with Fender, and Marshall pretty much always was cathode biased, because they wanted it's hard to cathode bias a 100-watter. It's easy to bias a 50-watter, but 100-watters are more difficult. So they moved on with that, and then you get the progression of they went along, like Fender and Marshall for the longest time just put out their normal standard stuff that they've been putting out for years, because it had a great market. They moved plenty of it. And then like with Paul Revere and that kind of model, getting involved with Fender, you started seeing Fender adding gain to their product. Then obviously after that, I'm coming out with adding, product with gain in it. First is with that preamp. The GP1000 was my very first big product that I ever came out with. And so did that. And then what we started seeing then was other rack preamp stuff, because that was during the rack era. Super high-end studio gear, all rack mount. People were using racks of gear. If you saw harmonizers and that kind of stuff, and amplifiers were almost secondary, right? They were more into all these rack effects and rack effects and rack effects. And after that, then we moved back into heads. Heads became really popular, and you started seeing, the Randalls and the Mesa Boogies were popular, and And obviously Fender, you know, still never stepped into that rock market. They still had their Fender market, which was like their blues and country players and, you know, that kind of stuff. And like I said, you kept seeing new companies coming up. Hiwatt was always there. Hiwatt, later on, they didn't change their design till way later on. They started adding gain. In the early days, it was just like what Pete Townsend played through, which were just stupidly clean, but big and powerful. The real me. And then, you know, I mean, there's so many companies that came out of, you know, the list goes on and on, because it was like every month you started seeing a new company popped out with their new model. You'd go to NAMM show and there'd be, you know, just like now, there's so many people that under these names that come out with a new amp or a Fender knockoff. You know, a lot of these companies now are knocking off old Marshalls and knocking off Fenders, and they have their idea of it. And I don't know, it just kept feeding on itself, right? Adding more and more. So I think once we got to the point of amps already showing up with distortion, amps already showing up with a lot of the features that we all wanted early on, it became a homogenized, you know, thing. I mean, it's, you know, I'm saying is it's hard for anybody to stand out and say, well, that's so different from this guy anymore. Do you know what I'm saying? It's to me, a lot of them sound the same, and same because a lot of them have taken the circuits off the internet, because a lot of people's circuits are out there. You know, you just download it and make your own version. I've seen a couple guys do some interesting stuff. Ingle, those guys, I commend them. They've tried some new stuff where they've taken parts like in the tone circuit and stuff and added pots where there were normally fixed resistors, and it gives little changes which you know, make them different. And so that's cool.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'd like to thank you again, Ali. It's been again an absolute pleasure. And you know, we keep in touch for sure.
Yeah. Tell me how this all goes.
Let you know how everything's going on, and you know, as Steve says, we might get in contact about some other things. You've been so interested, and you're obviously such a knowledgeable person in this area. So it's been, you know, we're so happy to have you tell us all this stuff and take the time.
Again, sorry, I hope I didn't bore you.
No, we can say no there.
Okay, well,
with complete authority.
Well, you have a wonderful day of what's left of it. And,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you know, I will actually start my day. So
yeah, there you go.